If you're looking for a review that tells you that Dune Spice Wars by Shido Games, the company behind Northgard, is a sort of a 4x real-time strategy game blend, more on that in a minute. It's a fun, enjoyable game in very early access, available now on Steam, and it's fun to play. Good news! I've already made one of those. That isn't really what this is, though. This is instead a sort of all your questions answered, not the boring detail, but the gory detail. A Dune Spice Wars review for a strategy gamer, if you will. Unpacking the most frequently asked questions that I received when I was streaming this in very early press review build access today, right here on my YouTube channel. Do subscribe, shameless plug, if you want to see more of those. Without any further ado, I'm going to jump in and discuss some really hot questions about Dune Spice Wars and review it in a little more sexy detail. Where does it sit within the strategy game genre? How does it play? Is it replayable? Is it worth a buy? What do you actually do? Let's discuss Dune Spice Wars. First and foremost, is it a real-time strategy game or a 4X game? And will it suit me if I'm a real-time strategy gamer or 4X gamer? The answer is it absolutely plays like a real-time strategy game. Don't be fooled. There is, of course, a year calendar thing up in the top right. There's a timer. You can pause the game, like in Stellaris and similar titles, and you'll probably need to from time to time, particularly as the game moves on, whether it's to catch up on a whole load of things, rescue some units from a worm that's jumping out of the ground, or make some really important diplomatic decisions to try and elect yourself to be leader of the game. More on victory conditions a little later in the video. But needless to say, it is absolutely a real-time game. This puppy is operating in real time. No turn-based anything about it. However, when they say it's a real-time strategy game with 4X elements, they're not trying to fool you. They're not trying to trick you into thinking it's both. It really does incorporate a lot of the familiar 4X elements. In some ways, we're kind of playing around with syntax, maybe splitting hairs here a bit. These days, the genres are quite overlapping, but if we think about the 4Xs, for example, things like explore, as you can see me doing here in the early game. I'm building scouts. I'm going out to find places to settle cities. In this case, it's villages, which will become my sort of outposts that I can then build on, right? This is not unfamiliar. My scouting units can go out and find goody hut type things where I can get more resources, additional units, so on and so forth. You build your small military, go out and skirmish, watch out for the rebels. There's a really classic 4X explore, exterminate theme that runs throughout. And more importantly, maybe Dune Spice Wars takes it to the next level as well with all of its yields. It really answers all of that classic 4X itch that we require. You've got your money, you've got your production or your plastic, you've got your manpower, kind of a little bit Hearts of Irony, but nowhere near as complicated. One of my moderators, Terentius, today said it reminded them a little bit of Bannerlord, and I kind of feel that too. It's inspired across the board from real-time strategy and 4X strategy alike, and it absolutely fits into the territorial map mold that Shido Games' previous game, Northgard, really fills. And if you've played Northgard, you'll feel somewhat familiar with Dune Spice Wars. It really challenges 4X's above and beyond when it comes to the diplomacy, the intrigue, the agencies, the operations in this game. It's a little too much for me to delve into all of them here, and maybe slightly out of scope. But what you need to know is you can do powerful things with up to 10 agents, whether it's building intelligence on your foes, like you can see here, learning the way of the land, buddying up with the banking system, or the council that rules everything. It's really interesting. It affects loads of different yields, and it can convert later in the game into missions that include game-winning espionage missions, like assassinating the leaders of other houses. So don't underestimate it. More on that in a little bit later too. Next up, the nitty-gritty of actually, how does it play? Well, performance-wise, it's pretty good. You can see it's fast, it's smooth. Maybe a little worse than Humankind by the time you get to sort of the early mid-game, if I were to draw a reasonable comparison from a game that I've played a lot of. But when you get to the late game, it does have that kind of classic late 4X game vibe. loads of units, loads of things happening on a map, lots of things for the game to process. If you've got the speed up, especially, of course, because this is a real time game where you can tune the speed up to 1.5 or 2 times as fast, your system may suffer. So bear that in mind. For me, in terms of the performance, I thought it was perfectly good enough. The soundtrack, or should I say the audio design, is relatively simple. It's no orchestral major soundtrack by any means, but it does a beautiful job at setting a subtle background scene. It's not too invasive, it has all of the requirements you need to shut up the voiceovers if they're a bit loud or whatever. It's really well done. Even just the aesthetic sound of the sand rolling over the hills in the background in a quiet scene, or war and conflict, units moving over the sand, a giant worm coming up. It's really well done. Credit to them. It's simple, absolutely, but it's effective. The graphics, I heard some really mixed, scathing reviews from them today in the live stream comments. They're not, by any stretch of the imagination, your NVIDIA ray tracing dreams. No siree, Bob. I think the map is pretty enough. It captures the world that it's meant to capture. More on that a little bit later in this too. I've got a lot of frequently asked questions to discuss here, so bear with me. But in a nutshell, I think it's a perfectly fine looking game. The map looks really good. The unit's textures may be a little rough around the edges, could use some smoothing there and in a few other places, I think. But by and large, nothing to complain about from me. And in terms of how does it play in actual pacing wise, it's fast enough. Of course, it varies a bit depending on the speed and how often you pause, but generally speaking, you could expect a game to take somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, providing you don't die early on and or fall into a death spiral, an economic spiral that you can't recover from. Forget to keep your harvesters harvesting spice because they've run away from a sandstorm or a giant worm or something, and then your entire economy goes bankrupt and you get invaded. These things can happen in a game like this. It doesn't have a single player setting in terms of campaign. It's definitely more of a sandbox mode, as you can see here. Bearing in mind, of course, this is a very early access review, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for me. A little bit more on modes later. There is no multiplayer at the moment, though. It is just this single player mode in this version of the game. I think that's totally fine, but it does raise another question that I get asked, or have been asked, somewhat often, and we discussed it today on stream. Is it replayable? How replayable is Dune Spice Wars? Particularly if we focus in specifically acknowledging, yikes for that unit, acknowledging that this is absolutely an early access. And not the kind of early access that is, oh, you know, we've finished this game and it's sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, early access, but really it's basically a final polished experience, kind of like a free trial. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have an early access that's a game that's just entirely broken and it's a poor developer or whatever, and they're like, please give me your money, I just need to make the game. Dune Spice Wars doesn't fall at either of those extremes. Definitely has more work to do and more to add, and that impacts the replayability. So if we assess it for what it is right now, it's a game with 4 houses, or civs, or factions, whatever you want to call them. Each one has 4 counselors. They have their own abilities that will likely impact your playstyle a little bit, not astronomically, but enough that you might pivot away from sort of a political espionage influence based game to more of a military based game, or an requiring more like all of the spice and building a powerful economy game. So the counselors matter, and they will add to some replayability, I think. Is it infinitely replayable though? No. In the future, we expect, and they've acknowledged that they will be adding mod support and multiplayer support. I think this could be a really interesting competitive multiplayer game at maybe a slightly faster game speed that is the current default, and I should note, only game speed available. You can change the difficulty level of the AI from easy, medium, hard, extra hard, insane. You can also change the size of the maps, small, medium, large, huge, but you can't change the actual pacing of the game. It would be interesting to see additions like that moving forward, although, of course, it would be difficult to take into account with balance and blah, 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 but it does come to mind when I think about multiplayer. because I think there is potentially a very bright future, dare I say, in multiplayer experiences for this game. Games like this can do very well in the multiplayer space if they play their cards right, although I won't put my hopes on that yet. We are very early access. Let's bear that in mind and keep that in mind as I move through and continue to discuss the rest of my more in depth discussion on Dune Spice Wars here. Obviously, you've noted by now that I'm playing as House Harkonnen in the background. I streamed this game today. I will be streaming it tomorrow at the time of recording, likely the day after that. It's a very enjoyable experience, and I'm loving sharing it. So if you'd like to see more, please like the video, and let's carry on with the damn video. Next up, do I need Dune lore? The game is called Dune Spice Wars. So therefore, it's a lot more specific than, say, something like civilization or humankind. These very broad, sweeping names given to very broad, sweeping, in their case, historical strategy games. Dune Spice Wars is very defined. Dune Spice Wars. You are fighting for spice in this world. More on that in my next question, because it does come up from time to time. You're fighting for the spice, you're fighting for the land, you want control of this planet, and you are vying for political, economic, and military control over this planet. Ultimately, to be its governor, to be its leader. If you're going through this Landsraad Council route, you can go the militaristic route if you choose, or you can take more of a diplomatic or score-based route too. More on that a little bit later in the piece here, though, because firstly, the answer to do I need Dune lore is no. While it's a very focused game, you don't need Dune lore to experience it. For example, I went into it knowing nothing. I'd watched the film. Something to note is that the factions are broadly the same, of course, but there are a few changes. One that was being discussed in my live stream today was the colors that are associated with the factions. The houses, for example, is different. Either way, I should note that this is based primarily off the world created in the books, or at least one branch of the books, rather than the film. However, I went in knowing nothing, watching the film, now intending to listen to the audiobook, so maybe they've suckered me into their world after all. But the answer is no. A categorical no. You do not need prior knowledge of Dune to enjoy this game. It is fundamentally a 4X real-time crossover strategy game. I would generally probably put it in the real-time camp rather than the 4X camp, but as I said at the start of the video, it incorporates both. You can absolutely play this if you've played any kind of strategy game before. And the one example that I would lean to is, and I draw on Northgard because Shido Games, the developers of this, also made that. I don't think many people thought, would I need to live in a medieval fantasy world like Northgard to play Northgard? And do I need to understand what that's like to do that? Right? The answer is no, you don't. You'll learn it as you go, and you can feel comfortable knowing that with Dune Spice Wars as well. Which brings me to my next point. It's actually quite a smooth segue. It's to do with the complexity of Dune Spice Wars. Irrespective of whether you understand the Dune lore or not, and as I've already covered, you don't really need to, so it doesn't really matter. The complexity of the game matters. It's a game where it should take you, according to the devs and my own experience, around 2 or 3 hours-ish to play through a game. So you can sit down and do it in one session, but you're not going to be cramming one out in 10 minutes between, I don't know, cooking dinner and doing the dishes. Sure. Either way, you're going to be here for a little while, but not a ridiculously long time. So how complex is it then? Well, I think that sets the parameter for it pretty well. This is a game that has some really good systems inside of its political systems in particular. Huge nuances. From early benefits of building up espionage points that literally just effectively scout an area and highlight locations of interest. Entirely useless generally if you have a scout unit floating around, which you will, because they tend to be a lot less useful as the game goes on, particularly as discoveries start to disappear as you finish with them and you're focusing on bigger, more important things. Dune Spice Wars actually strikes, I have to say, so far, a really good balance in complexity. It's easy enough to learn and understand. The tutorial isn't in your face. It's really just some glorified tooltips. which, to be honest, the game could probably use from having a few more of, particularly when you mouse over a resource for the first time, like influence, espionage, these things that you might understand but not necessarily know what they could be spent on or where you might be earning them from. It could benefit from a little bit more of that. But the upside here is that the tutorial is nice and effective enough, but absolutely not in your face. And the rest of the mechanics are like that as well. You kind of just pick it up as you go. The military is the most obvious one. You train a few military units. They're capped by command points. Mine currently here on screen are at 9 out of 18 total command points. Stronger units are worth more points. Generally speaking, you might not have more than around 10 units under your control. This is not a spam out 200 units in Age of Empires and stomp them across the map. This is a very different game. Military is still very strong, and you can absolutely go for a military supremacy conquest victory. You can support it with some diplomatic actions that can weaken opponents' capital city defenses and all sorts of useful things, but you can absolutely go out and conquest. But to a lesser extent, really, military serves this purpose. It's about taking villages, it's about taking these outposts, as I often refer to them, establishing yourself and then using them to extract resources from the land. You extract water, for example, a vital resource, especially in a desert planet. Combine that with your authority, and you can use that to take control, to take command of these outposts that you've taken over militarily. From there, you don't necessarily need your military except to defend or stop some rebels. You can win completely through diplomatic action, through hegemony, and through supremacy, which ties me nicely into the last sort of broad category for this video. What do you actually do in Dune Spice Wars? What makes Dune Spice Wars different from the rest? Effectively asking, is it worth it? Should I buy it? In Dune Spice Wars, it is, of course, a battle for the spice. But as I was just saying, it's handled in a really delicate way. There are three different branches playing out. There is a supremacy branch, where you try and take everything and leave no one standing. This can be achieved through military conquest, which is really difficult, particularly on the opponent's actual cities. These things are really strong. Doable, but they are strong. Bear that in mind. Or you could also take a more sort of intrigue, a more devilish approach to supremacy through spying, diplomacy. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you can actually assassinate through a series of relatively expensive and time-consuming diplomatic missions the head of the other houses and just get rid of them that way. The other options and sort of end goals towards victory in Dune Spice Wars then lean towards diplomacy through elections at the Lansard Council, for example. One notable example to me is one that I had on stream today. I was playing through, and spoiler alert, don't listen to the next 30 seconds if you want to watch that video, played through and ended up winning with the diplomatic victory, the election victory. I was crowned governor thanks to my supreme diplomacy. It's a really interesting system the way it plays out. You sort of earn these diplomatic points by either upgrading your outposts or researching them through the development tree, which is kind of like the tech tree essentially. Maybe you're earning them through your spies, your agents, as they're called. Depending on where you place them, where they're building their intrigue, gathering their intelligence, you can earn more or less of actually any resource in the game. It's a really well-threaded, well-thought-through system. The entire agents and diplomacy system is that way. And you can use it to your advantage to tie political power, not just with the other houses, but also with the sort of effectively barbarian villages, these smaller settlements that you trade with and build up a relationship with. You can eventually send one of your agents there, one of your diplomats, so to speak, and get a unique bonus out of them all. And they'll provide you with more votes when it comes to voting in the Lansard Council, because there's a lot of them. They really matter. They were actually the crowning jewel that won me my game. Either way, you can win through that diplomacy, and then lastly, you can win through hegemony, which is the score system. It's used throughout the game for other things as well, though. Like, for example, at 2000 hegemony, your capital city can be built upon with very powerful, sometimes unique infrastructures. So it does matter as you move through. You also unlock more benefits to your house specific benefits. Kind of think of these as your humankind culture's traits or your civ's unique bonus, right? You unlock more of these at different hegemony levels, 5,000 and then 10,000. So it's not just a victory condition. Again, it's laced through the game. It's very clever. No victory condition is just a victory condition, and none of them are ring fenced behind any sort of arbitrary scoring system, except for the fact that hegemony is ranked numerically in a score. It takes almost everything into account, from all kinds of things like water surplus to the total number of villages you control, the amount of damage you've dealt, or military experience you've earned. There are about 10 or 15 different things that are being factored into the equation, and that's just the things that are being upfronted. You can also purposefully earn more hegemony by building improvements or developments on your villages that add points to it, or conducting espionage missions with your agents to get more of it. It's a very interesting system. It's a victory mechanic. It's also a ring fencing, scaling, sort of leveling up system as you move through the game. It helps to build a really neat world in Dune Spice Wars. Of course, this is early access, a press preview build. I haven't operated off a lot of sleep over the last few days since I got it, though. And that's not necessarily because I think that Dune Spice Wars is the best game ever, but it's a really enjoyable one. Which brings me through into my final point, and the main, perhaps, question of a review. Is it worth it? Obviously, ultimately, the cop out answer here is that's up to you. Is it worth it? Oh, that's up to you. Right? But here's my 2 cents for what it's worth. This game has kept me very interested. It's in very early access, so bear that in mind. You're getting a limited experience. No multiplayer, no mods, and 4 houses. 4 very well developed, uniquely built, lore defined, but not required to really utilize them and enjoy them houses. They are brilliant. The game will need more for it to be truly successful, though. Okay? So do bear that in mind. This is not a final product. Thankfully, that's reflected in its price. It is on sale, or I should say, it's retailing. And again, I'm not trying to sell you anything, no affiliate links whatsoever, opinions entirely my own. But it retails at, I think, depending on your area and where you live, around half the price of a normal sort of AAA game. Um, that's, I think, 30 euros instead of 60, maybe. I don't know how it. I don't know the equivalent for most of you, the banes of living in New Zealand, but it is a very cheap game relative to most new release strategy titles. That, of course, reflects its new, and very early access stance. Thankfully, it's a stable game. It performs well enough, although do check those minimum system requirements because they might be slightly higher than what you think. It has enough variety to keep you interested, and because each game has enough difference and nuance and random things can occur and happen out of the blue that aren't super unpredictable but are definitely wild, like a giant worm coming out and swallowing half of your army, to really put some urgency on you, to really put you on the back foot. I feel like every time I've sat down to play Dune Spice Wars, it's always been a kind of I sit down, I rub my hands together, and I think, okay, I'm going to play Dune. And I could be playing this for 30 minutes and get horrifically eaten and swallowed up and lose. Or I could play for 3 hours and win the game through one of these developing story arcs, probably a combination of all three, with enough randomness but planned espionage and beautiful world building that keeps me coming back every time. I'm really looking forward to seeing how Dune Spice Wars develops, how they take it through its early access phase. How long will it last in this phase? Likely a while. And what will it look like when it's done? But to answer the question, is it worth it? Right now, I think the answer is yes. And if you've made it through this video and you were interested enough to be engaged right the way through, the answer is probably almost certainly a yes. That'll do for me. Thank you very much for watching. I'll have plenty more Dune Spice Wars, including tips and tricks and future live streams right here on YouTube and Twitch. So don't go away, but do go away because this is the end of the video.